Good afternoon, everyone. I think it is afternoon. It's 2 minutes past 12, so that classifies as afternoon. I was just making sure I didn't make the same mistake as I made at 10 o'clock this morning when I started babbling on and I hadn't actually shared my slides. So this is the second of 3 webinars I'm doing today, so I'm meeting myself coming back at the moment. But delighted that you could join us today. I think this one's been rescheduled at least once. So if you're here today, thanks for bearing with us. So we're talking about the new CLP regulation. So CLP stands for classification, labeling and packaging of chemicals. So we're going to dive straight in because there's quite a lot to cover. So by means of a brief introduction, I've got a highlight slide because I've been strongly encouraged by my colleagues to include one of those. Before I delve into the detail, we're going to cover what the new CLP regulation aims to achieve. We'll cover why the EU has decided to revamp it or amend it. And then we're going to go through step by step the main areas that are changed. And then we'll take a look at what does that mean for us as GB manufacturers, and obviously we're third country businesses just like other manufacturers in the likes of China and Indonesia and so on are third country businesses. So what does that mean for those businesses without an establishment in the EU? What does it mean for them to comply with this new CLP regulation? And then we'll talk a little bit about the regulations timeline, so you know what you have to do by when. And then we'll talk a little bit about, okay, from a standing stop today, what can we do to plan to comply, which I hope all of you impacted are going to comply, because the EU is still strategically a very important market for us here in Great Britain. So regulatory highlights. The first bullet point there is the regulation's official name. So Regulation 2024-2865. It amends regulation, the existing CLP regulation. And so really both sets have to be read in conjunction with one another, because the new regulation just refers to changes that are made to the existing regulation. So you really need to look at both sets when you're interpreting it. But hopefully I've done a fair bit of the legwork on that for you today. Products in scope. So we're talking about chemical substances. So that could be industrial chemicals, specialty chemicals, raw materials used in manufacturing, but as well as chemical substances, also mixtures. So consumer products, they could be detergents, paints, cosmetics, so on. Industrial formulations, agricultural mixtures as well. The regulation specifically introduces new hazard classes, and there is a ton of up-to-date requirements concerning labelling of product, and some of you will be delighted to hear that we're making the transition towards digital labelling slowly but surely. It does, however, introduce the requirement for companies based outside of the EU to have some form of EU representation, which we'll cover off separately. The regulation as well helps and refers throughout to other pieces of regulation that's linked very closely with it. So the very much part of the new regulation is to achieve that closer alignment with REACH regulation and other EU chemical safety frameworks. Obviously, with the proliferation of online sales to consumers now, there's much stricter coverage of online trade, and in line with the EU's sustainability agenda, there is a lot more reference to sustainability concerns. So not just looking about the welfare of human health and so on, but also what impact these products have on the environment and how can we mitigate their impact. In terms of the timeline, it's already in force. Most obligations will be mandatory from mid next year, with full compliance expected the beginning of 2027. So there is time, folks. So there's no need to go into a blind panic here. What's the regulation's objectives fundamentally? So it's really at its base is to protect people and the environment from hazardous chemicals. So that's the first thing. But it's also to establish a framework that allows the free movement of those chemical substances, mixtures, and articles within the internal market. So within the EU, 27 member states, the EEA markets, and also Northern Ireland. And it's to provide a framework that ensures that manufacturers, importers, or downstream users of these substances or mixtures classify, label, and package those hazardous chemicals appropriately before placing them on the market. So the consumer or the individual and the environment's well-being are safeguarded. And then similarly to establish a legally binding hazard identification and classification set of rules, and then set out common rules by which consumers and workers are able to make informed decisions based on those common rules on labeling. Can't talk today, honestly. In terms of regulatory basis and alignment, there's actually several pieces of several legislative instruments that use CLP for risk management on chemicals. So REACH regulation I've mentioned already, but we've also got biocidal products regulation, plant protection products regulation, cosmetics regulation, detergents regulation. They're all inextricably linked and they draw from CLP for that risk management on chemicals. The regulation is actually based on the United Nations globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, or GHS, as it's shortened to determine whether a substance or a mixture should be classified and labeled as hazardous. Now, in terms of the compliance timeline, there are different dates for the applicability of the new rules, but obligations, as I said earlier, broadly will generally apply from the 1st of July 2026. Some rules, like those on label formatting, are applicable from the 1st of January 2027. And substances and mixtures which have been placed on the market within those periods don't need to be relabeled and repackaged based on the new rules. So they'll be able to continue to be in supply on the EU market for some time. I think that the timelines are the 1st of July 28 and 1st of January 2029 respectively. Okay. So why the revamp? Well, fundamentally, number one is to keep pace with globalization, new technological developments, and new means of sale. Getting back to that kind of like distance sales and online sales, it was really deemed necessary to adapt the existing CLP regulation to keep pace with all of that, recognizing fully that EU consumers particularly don't just receive goods from EU manufacturers, but also there's an acknowledgement that economic operators established outside of the union, so companies like here in GB, also sell chemicals online directly to the general public within the EU. So the CLP provides a lot more safeguards or measures around protecting the consumer in those circumstances. It also serves to impose the requirement for third country manufacturers without an EU presence to appoint a supplier that's established in the union. Essentially, if you've sat in on any of my webinars before, you'll know that when it comes to product safety and so on, the EU prefers to deal with a natural person or a legal person established in the EU, so a local natural or legal person, when it comes to product safety issues. So they want those third country manufacturers without a presence in the EU to basically appoint a supplier established within the union to ensure that that relevant substance or mixture meets with the requirements of the regulation. But it also serves to kind of provide more cohesion amongst those regulations that bear weight on CLP and kind of interoperate with CLP. So that would be like your market surveillance compliance regulation, single market for digital services when it comes to online sales and so on. GPSR, a big one that a number of you have been through the hoops with that. So there's a lot of regulation that interacts with CLP, and the new version of the regulation or the amendments makes it clearer as to how they interoperate and how they interoperate, to be honest. There's much greater focus on the environment within the new regulation as well. So as well as that kind of human health, there's more focus on the environment. So, you know, it references how we need to take care around labeling and packaging, because that can have a bearing on sorting and recycling, which all ties into the EU circular economy ambitions. And there's also specific requirements around refill stations, because so much of the EU sustainability regulation at the moment, both packaging waste regulation and the eco design for sustainable products, talks about that kind of, you know, limiting waste and reuse of certain things. So we're going to see over the course of the coming years a rise in the number of refill stations across the EU. And so the new CLP regulation has to basically have specific rules and conditions for those refill cells to establish a list of hazard classes and categories for which sale at a refill station is prohibited, for example. And making sure that the appropriate labels and elements of certain chemicals, such as fuels, diesels, exhaust fluids, windscreen fluids, all those kind of things, that they are labeled correctly. Also, the regulation needs to provide for more clarity and consistency of acute toxicity estimates, and importantly, impress upon the supplier the requirement to report those to the European Chemicals Agency, as they already do for M factors and concentration limits. It also has it imposes a change in terms of the deadline for a supplier to update labels. So where there's a new hazard class identified in addition to an existing hazard class, or perhaps it's a more severe hazard class, then the timeline or the deadline is reduced from 18 months to 6 months for turnaround of those labels. Conversely, the 18-month deadline still applies for new but less severe hazard classes or categories. And the 18-month deadline also still applies for any changes that are triggered by any delegated acts or implementation of new or amended provisions under the GHS. It also provides for a lot of change around labelling. So the first one would be, there is a list of additional hazard statements that previously only had to be on the label of certain mixtures. They'll now need to be applied to all mixtures that are listed in Part 2 of Annex 2, whether or not they're classified or contain any classified substance. That's the first one. Fold-out labels are going to be permitted to be used on a regular basis, essentially, so long as the application and formatting rules are followed, and they're quite stringent within the regulation itself, and making sure that the label can be you know, read easily and accessible, and making sure that, you know, the specific content on the front, inner and back pages isn't impacted. Going back to the sustainability piece before, the regulation does reference how care needs to be taken colouring on labels, so to make sure that consumers don't confuse those colours with specific recycling data, so that those colours don't conflict or confuse that recycling data. And then we've got the provision for voluntary digital labelling. So I think the EU is, and we're moving towards this with digital product passports anyway, but the EU is recognizing that, that digital labeling can be a real benefit for certain groups, especially vulnerable groups, with impaired vision or so on. And even in the case of non-native speakers, if they can access that information online in their own native language, even though it's not on the label of the product itself, then it's a benefit. The digital carrier, so the provider of the QR code and so on, will have to abide by quite stringent regulation, but that's already been formulated as part of the Digital Product Passport Delegated Act. I would imagine it'll just be the same kind of thing. Putting information online or accessible digitally doesn't replace the need for the essential safety information to go on the label itself. But safety information can be replicated online, and non-safety related information can obviously be put online as well. I think that's all subject to a delegated act. So if you're signed up for updates with GDT, then we'll probably do an update webinar as we get more and more information on the new CLP, and we'll just update you as we know more. So the main areas changed, and bear with me, this is, I can't make regulation sexy or interesting. I do try, but sometimes you've just got to kind of get through the fundamentals. So I'm going to talk you through the main areas of change. So if you were looking at the kind of existing CLP and the changes, then you have an idea of what it all means. You'll get a copy of the recording and a copy of the slides after this presentation, so don't feel like you have to do loads of furious scribbling. So the first kind of area that's changed is Article 2, which refers to definitions. It's the same format as every piece of EU regulation, and essentially introduces new definitions referring to acute toxicity, data carrier, refill and refill stations. So that's the first one. Article 4 covers the expanded hazard classes. So CLP has 5 new hazard classes, and any substance or mixture is going to have to be evaluated against those hazard classes. It also has labelling changes, so there are mandatory formatting rules, so referring to minimal font size, line spacing, text colour and so on. As I mentioned just a moment ago, there's greater flexibility for fold-out labels and leaflets, but with strict content rules. And then obviously that digital labelling is allowed for QR codes and online access, but it's voluntary and it's subject to quite strict conditions. Article 4 also refers to online sales, so just reinforcing the fact that hazard information has to be clear and accessible to consumers when the product is placed on a digital or an online marketplace. It reinforces the need for an EU-based supplier or representative for products sold in the union where the manufacturer doesn't have an EU presence. And then it has that sustainability link. So it aligns classification and labelling with the EU Green Deal, its goals, that whole safer, more sustainable chemicals and so on. So that's pretty much Article 4 in a nutshell. And you'll see throughout the new regulation, some paragraphs and sections have been entirely removed, some have been amended, some have been introduced as brand new. Article 5 introduces a number of new sections, which is a key example of this. So one of them is that classifications must reflect the combined hazard profile. So the known hazard of each constituent and the known hazard of the overall substance. So that kind of ensures that any impurities or additives that pose risks are not overlooked. It also stresses that manufacturers must classify based on the worst case evidence from constituents. So the whole substance data can strengthen or confirm the hazard conclusions, but can't dilute them. So that rule is designed to ensure that any hidden risks like carcinogenic impurities or endocrine active endocrine active additives are fully captured in classification. And then it reinforces also that constituent data comes first, so must evaluate each known constituent, so the main chemical, its impurities and its additives, for biodegradation. I can't speak today, really, I can't. Persistence, mobility, and bioaccumulation. Article 6 is quite similar, but it applies to mixtures. So when you've got a formulation that includes more than one substance, and it basically puts the onus on manufacturers, importers, and downstream users, to identify all available information about the mixture, examine that information to determine any hazards, and apply classification criteria. And that basically ensures that mixtures are classified consistently and often by looking at the hazards of their components. Article 9 concerns the 5 new categories that I referred to. So they're covered in there. And Article 9 imposes even stricter evaluation rules. So companies have to systematically assess hazard information against these new classes, not just the older ones. So those 5 are listed. Article 10 is significantly more prescriptive than the existing Article 10. So the existing Article 10 deals mainly with general principles of classification based on available information. But the new Article 10 details rules for evaluating multi-constituent substances and mixtures. And also, it's almost like devising a process that you must go through. So multi-constituent substances and mixtures, adding a weight of evidence, expert judgment requirements, and integrates bridging principles and fallback methods for classification. So it's a whole kind of like framework. It's much broader and it's much more prescriptive than the existing Article 10. Article 13 again provides a structured framework specifying how manufacturers, importers, and downstream users have to evaluate data, apply bridging principles, use weight of evidence, and follow fallback methods when classifying substances and mixtures. And Article 18 provides an amended list of acute toxicity impacts. There's something like 7 additional toxicity impacts that are listed in Article 18. Article 23 concerns a kind of labelling derogation for ammunition, where labelling on the actual product, on the immediate product itself, could cause a safety issue or impede the functioning of the weapon or the firearm, for example. Then there's a derogation against putting the label on the immediate product, and it can be placed on its secondary packaging. Article 25, we're halfway through, folks. There's only 61, and then not all of them are changed. Article 25 introduces stricter rules on supplemental labelling information. So it provides a lot clearer obligations for supplier identification and new digital labelling options. So the labelling must clearly identify that EU-based supplier where the manufacturer is not based in the EU. And certain, as I mentioned before, certain supplemental information can now be provided in that digital format and updated digitally, and accessed via a QR code or some other kind of data access methodology. And this essentially is deemed to be quite a good move. Well, it is full stop with all information that goes on products when we eventually move to QR codes, because it kind of modernizes CLP for the e-commerce environment, but it also reduces that label clutter, something that even businesses that aren't dealing with hazardous goods are, dealing with, shoving so much information on the product and on its packaging just to comply with various pieces of EU regulation. So the sooner that we move towards digital product passports, the better, really. It also, Article 25 also has restrictions on supplemental information. So details have to be clear and avoid any kind of contradiction and avoid diluting or distracting from the hazard communication. So that there's very much a stronger emphasis on that kind of clarity and readability. And then, as I mentioned before, alignment with the new hazard classes. So any supplemental any supplemental implementation must now explicitly cover those new hazards also. Okay, nearly there. Article 29. So currently, the existing CLP allows for certain exemptions from labelling and packaging rules, and they are in the case of very small packaging, under 125 mil where space is severely constrained, um, or for substances and mixtures classified only for less severe hazards, and also for gas containers, transport packaging, and so on. The new regulation has dramatically reduced the scope of exemptions. So there are far fewer hazard classes that qualify for reduced labelling. And serious hazards like carcinogen, I can't say this word, I've tried all morning, carcinogenicity, you know what I mean. And the similar ones are no longer eligible for simplified labels. So I'll put that on an email. Maybe you can pronounce them, but I'm struggling. Article 30. So there are much tightened obligations on updating labelling. So as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, currently suppliers have to update labelling when a new hazard information becomes available or a change in classifications occurred. But there's usually a grace period of 18 months permitted for mixtures that are already placed on the market before that update. So that immediate relabelling isn't required. New regulation is much stricter and much more prescriptive. So that grace period is reduced to 6 months in certain circumstances. So where the hazard is, severe, for example. The new Article 30 as well also makes it explicit that the manufacturer, importer, and downstream user are responsible for making sure that labels are updated. So it removes the exclusive burden from the original manufacturer. So not just the supplier in general, this kind of spreads accountability for that labeling across the whole supply chain. Article 32 concerns the location of information on the label. So existing CLP has required that hazard pictograms, signal words, hazard statements, and precautionary statements are all placed together on the label. But rules were really quite flexible in terms of, they weren't very prescriptive as to the exact formatting, font size, contrast, or, left a lot to industry practice and individual manufacturers' interpretation. The new regulation is much more prescriptive and detailed. So there's mandatory grouping and hierarchy. So hazard pictograms, signal words, hazard statements, precautionary statements, and so on have to be grouped together in a really clearly visible area of the label. And supplemental supplemental information has to be placed separately. So you'd have all of your kind of hazard grouping together, and then your supplemental information has to be placed separately so it doesn't dilute or distract from the hazard communication. There's much stricter requirements around readability as well, so reinforcing the new minimum font size and line spacing rules, which are already introduced in Article 18. And ensuring that hazard information is not only grouped but also legible at a glance. So it can't be too small. There are very strict rules as to how that needs to be presented on the label. And then contrast and background. So hazard information can't be printed in black on a white background. must be printed in black on a white background to maximize clarity. And then that closes the gaps where colored or low contrast labels previously obscured hazard details, which now isn't permitted. Digital and distance sales alignment is covered in this article as well. So location rules apply equally to online and digital labels, so that hazard information has to be presented upfront, not hidden in the supplemental sections or links when those products are subject to distance sales or sales via an online platform. And then expanded hazard scope. So this article as well explicitly covers those new hazard classes, making sure that the label information is grouped and visible in the same way as the traditional hazard classes, if that makes sense. Article 34, this is an entirely new provision under CLP. So it's introduced in the revised CLP regulation, and it represents a massive departure from the existing CLP, which doesn't have a dedicated article on digital labelling. So existing general labelling obligations, which are kind of covered through from Article 17 to 33, are focused on physical labels that are affixed to packaging. So the new regulation focuses on physical and digital labelling. So in terms of dual labelling, sorry, I've just lost my page there. In terms of dual labelling, you've got core hazard information, so your pictograms, your signal words, hazard statements, and so on, always have to appear physically on the label. But then certain supplemental information can now be provided digitally on the and accessed via the QR code. Digital hazard information has to be free, it has to be accessible and available before purchase. So the consumer must be able to evaluate that information before they make that purchase. And it has to be updated in line with Article 30, so updating labels, so it must be kept up to date. In terms of restrictions on digital labelling, the digital information, as I mentioned a moment ago, cannot, and it's reiterated in Article 34, it cannot replace mandatory physical hazard elements, and it can't contradict or obscure physical label content. Now, as time moves on, we may see that more and more information moves towards that kind of digital labeling rather than hard labeling on the product. But for the moment, that it's really supplemental information that can go on, can be accessed online, and essential safety information must be with the product, but can also be online as well. There's flexibility for small packaging, so that digital labeling can be used to reduce clutter on small containers, but obviously maintaining that mandatory hazard information is important, that's physically present with the product. And then there will the digital labeling rules explicitly cover the new hazard classes as well. Article 35 adds a condition for the sale of hazardous substances at refill stations. So as I mentioned earlier, all part of kind of like the circular economy. So there is a specific article that covers the sale of hazardous substances at those refill stations. Article 36, under this article, harmonisation now explicitly covers the new hazard classes introduced in 2024, and just by I've only listed a couple of them here, but endocrine disruptors, persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, very persistent, very bioaccumulative, and a whole load more. I can provide these to you separately. Article 37 tightens the procedure for harmonisation of classification and labelling of substances. So currently, remember, this is where we start moving more towards how the EU and the relevant member states will monitor this and govern the whole regulation away from the supplier's obligations. So there's a natural flow to EU regulation, and it usually follows the same way. So Article 37 tightens the procedure for harmonisation of classification and labelling of substances. So currently, member states can submit proposals to the European Chemicals Agency, or ECHA, and the focus is mainly on substances with serious hazards. But the revised regulation enables ECHA to take a much more proactive approach, or a much more proactive role, and has an expanded hazard scope. So those extended hazard classes. And there are, in addition to all of that, and ECHA's expanded role, there's also new defined timelines for submission, review, and adoption of proposals. So everything is kind of like speeding up and becoming much more consolidated, or just smooth running, if you like. Article 38, this really adds scope, transparency, and accessibility requirements to those harmonised classification and labelling decisions. So currently, accessibility is limited. So opinions and decisions are published, but the supporting data and the kind of rationale that led to those decisions aren't available to the public. So under the new article, opinions and decisions on proposals will be explicitly published, and together with the decision rationale will be detailed alongside it. Article 42, this makes really important changes to the classification and labelling inventory that's maintained by the European Chemicals Agency, or ECHA, and that provides that or requires manufacturers, importers to notify ECHA of the classification and labelling of substances placed on the market, that they've placed on the market, unless it's already registered under REACH. Now, the inventory is public, but data quality is varied and really a little bit poor. So the new article again puts it under the remit of ECHA, and it's a lot more, it's a lot clearer as to the scope, the quality, the requirements, and the accessibility rules that ECHA will have to follow. So ECHA is going to be tasked with essentially monitoring the quality and usability of that data, the data of of that, and reducing any duplication and contradictions which has marred it in the past. Article 45 makes important changes to how member states appoint and manage bodies responsible for receiving information in the case of emergency health response and so on, so often linked to poison centres. So the scope of responsibility is clarified, and it makes it clear that it's not just about that body receiving the data, but also ensuring it's usable in the case of an emergency. So Article 45 is pretty hard hitting. Article 48, this revises the existing article and broadens the scope of advertising, but tightens the obligations. So digital and online advertising is explicitly covered, which it wasn't before. And stipulates that hazard information has to be clearly visible before purchase in e-commerce or online catalogues and digital ads, like I mentioned before, but it expressly states that. And then it also expands the hazard scope. So advertising obligations now explicitly include the 5 new hazard classes also. Almost there. Task of the agency, and this is really the stuff that is to do with the internal machinations and workings of the union here. But Article 50 dramatically expands the tasks of the European Chemicals Agency. So it revises the existing article and it adds scope, digitalisation and proactive responsibility. So ECHA must now manage systems for digital labelling. It has tasks that explicitly cover the new hazard classes. It has to provide technical and digital infrastructure for poison centre notifications and a whole host of other stuff. So there's been a lot more power and a lot more authority and obligations placed on ECHA. Article 52 is one of those safety valves that lets member states, if they believe that the EU regulation or the EU harmonisation isn't enough to protect the health or the environment in their own member state, they can basically apply to overrule it, or to have a special kind of change for change to the regulation. So they have to provide a scientific rationale, and they have to be able to provide supporting data for that as well, and a substantial weight of evidence if they want to invoke that safeguard clause. But in return, the Commission and ECHA have to review that safeguard notification within set deadlines. So they've got quite quick turnarounds to basically say, you know, yes, we'll pass this, or no, we won't. Article 53 is a provision that allows the EU to keep CLP up to date with science and technological advancements and so on. And basically without having to go back to all of the member states and seek their permission on so much of this. So they have what's referred to in the existing regulation as well as adaptations to technical progress, or ATPs. They've historically been issued every 1 to 2 years, but the Commission is now required to adopt ATPs more quickly, and certainly in response to new scientific evidence or GHS updates when and if they arise. Article 54 strengthens the reporting and the review obligations for the Commission. So under the existing CLP regulation, the Commission was meant to conduct a high-level review and report of the regulation every 5 years to see how it was functioning in practice, were any updates required to align with the UN GHS and so on. But now this has been much more tightened. So now the Commission has to report every 3 years, so 2 years 2 years sooner, and has to be a lot more detailed and thorough in its review and its reporting. So it has to cover the new hazard classes, it has to assess the effectiveness of the digital labelling, evaluate how CLP interacts with other EU chemicals legislation like REACH and biocide, and reports have to be made publicly accessible, not just submitted to Parliament and the Council. So that's a big departure in terms of how the Commission monitors the efficiency or the effectiveness of this regulation. And then finally, Article 62. Article 62 makes explicit the transitional detail that isn't in CLP, so adds clarity and transitional detail around the implementation of the regulation. So transitional periods apply to new rules. They're now explicitly referenced and linked to specific provisions. So the new hazard classes have a phased application date. The digital labelling obligations in Article 34 have their own transitional deadlines. And they are all kind of referenced in Article 62. So we know exactly what is taking effect and when. It also now explicitly ties entry into force to any future delegated acts. Those of you that have been on some of my webinars before will know that delegated acts are kind of like implementation guidelines. They're submitted after the regulation comes into force and put a bit more meat on the bones in terms of how regulation is to be implemented. So Article 62 ties the entry into force date with any delegated acts and adaptations to technical processes or technical progress, sorry. So it just kind of like provides for that smooth integration of updates, make sure that everything is coming into force and when it's meant to, and that importantly, companies that have to comply have forewarning of their compliance obligations and can meet them in the time windows that they've got. Oh my goodness! So that is kind of the main changes, and again, you can have a copy of these slides that then go through those. In terms of the implications for the EU and third country businesses. So obviously, let's just focus on third country businesses being, GB, because they're the ones that we're most interested in today or most concerned with. So with the expanded hazard classes, obviously as exporters in GB, we're going to have to reevaluate our substances and mixtures against those new hazard classes, and then update our safety data sheets and labels accordingly. Thinking about labeling and packaging changes, so we're going to have to redesign labels and packaging to meet these new standards, which are kind of helpfully almost, this is what you need to do. They're not up for interpretation. So I think that's really quite helpful. So even though UK CLP doesn't require it yet, because UK CLP at the minute is a direct, it's virtually exactly the same as the EU CLPs, but we're going to have to operate two sets of labeling and potentially two sets of packaging, one for the domestic market GB and one for EU. So even though UK CLP doesn't require it yet, we're going to have to redesign those labels and packaging. So as I said, it's really quite helpful that the regulation breaks down exactly what that labeling and packaging must look like. So there's much stricter formatting rules, minimum font, line spacing, color contrast, guidance on those fold out labels and digital labeling, and then guidance on that hazard information when it's when that product is subject to distance sales or B2C consignments. And then I think that the next thing is, which is always a sticking point, is understanding who's going to represent. If you don't have an EU presence, then who are you going to appoint as your kind of responsible person, or your EU representation, for want of a better word. And that company has to know enough about the product and the regulation and so on to be able to ensure compliance on your behalf, if that makes sense. So that can be an importer, distributor, fulfillment service provider, and so on. So it's really exploring your existing networks and understanding who could you appoint to take on that role for you. And then I think, due diligence and documentation, because there are so many changes, I think you can never be too belts and braces with the evidence that you maintain and the documentation that you maintain. So as exporters to the EU, complying with the new CLP regulation, we're going to have to really maintain that very robust documentation of hazard assessments, testing, classification decisions, and so on. Important to mention that courts can compel disclosure of hazard information if, in the case of a defective product or something like that, and failure to disclose that hazard information can lead to presumptions of defectiveness, which is not something that you want. So having that robust data is absolutely paramount. As I mentioned before, that divergence between the UK and the EU CLP, we're just, as we are with so many pieces of regulation at the minute, we're facing that dual compliance burden, and it just adds cost and it adds complexity in product stewardship. But we've kind of like got no option. The UK is really falling behind in terms of its alignment with EU regulation, not just on CLP, but all of the sustainability regulation that the EU is bringing into force. We are way behind. So we do have a period over the next few years of operating kind of like dual regulatory regimes, if you like. I think when we think about the strategic and commercial implications, you know, not to sound kind of, you know, alarmist about it, but if we don't align with those CLP obligations, then there's a risk of market exclusion, obviously. There's a significant disadvantage if we lag behind other EU firms that are adopting the new rules, which they will have to. Then there's an argument that says if we don't keep up with that pace of change, then, you know, we lose our competitiveness. And I just always think that voluntary alignment with any regulation like EU CLP just builds a level of trust and reputation with consumers and business customers alike. So there's definitely a lot to take on in terms of understanding what does this mean to my business and what body of work have I got to do, and you know, how do I resource that internally? But what I would say is that we do have time. We've got quite a lot of time, really. Talking about time, here's the regulation timeline. So we're looking at, I would have you focus on July next year as the majority of hazard classes become applicable. But then the labelling side of things, we have until the beginning of 2027 to get that in place. I'll let you read through this at your leisure. And then planning for compliance. So I've just popped some things down here that you might want to do, or certainly how I would start to approach this. So I'd always start with a gap analysis. So compare the UK CLP with the new EU CLP obligations. Identify those products impacted by the new hazard classes. Map which mixtures and substances are going to require that reclassification. And, you know, as with any of this, when time is constrained or when budgets are constrained, then, you know, prioritizing certain products, certain focuses is absolutely paramount. So I would focus first on my high volume exports and products that are likely to fall under these new hazard categories, like you know, polymers, agrochemicals, and so on. So really looking at, okay, what are my priority products for the EU, and what are the ones that, you know, we need to prioritize to get compliant first. And then hazard re-evaluation, so reclassifying those substances and mixtures against the new hazard classes, those 5 new hazard classes, updating any product safety data sheets and technical dossiers, and making sure that hazard information is consistent across EU and UK versions. Because the thing is, you're not going to lose out by aligning with the EU regulation, because it's always going to be the gold standard, and the UK will catch up eventually. But it's making sure that, you know, where you have enhanced your CLP compliance, that it applies to products that you are shipping domestically as well. And then labelling and packaging redesign. So again, you know, looking at new formatting rules, looking at what information you can get away with going on online and being accessed digitally, adapting packaging for that fold-out format if you haven't been doing that already. And again, you know, I would focus on those consumer-facing products where labelling and visibility is absolutely critical and will be inspected by customs as well as market surveillance authorities. The supply chain representation is a bit of a stickler. It's basically looking at your existing network and thinking, okay, you know, who can I appoint to act as the kind of liable party in the EU, and then update contracts to clarify responsibilities, your responsibilities and their responsibilities for that classification, labelling and packaging. And again, it's kind of, I would prioritise those products that you sell into the EU without having a distribution partner, because they are the ones that you're not going to be able to sell anymore without that representation. And then evidence and documentation systems. So, you know, strengthening that record keeping for those hazard evaluations, having all that testing data, having those classification decisions, always be prepared for evidence disclosure obligations, because like I said, if you fail to provide that data, it can lead to a presumption of defectiveness, like a ruling against you. And understand that, you know, there will be products that it's more complex to do that for, and more time consuming to do that for. So I would prioritize those and start the ball rolling with those first. Insurance and risk management, I can't stress the importance of insurance, liability insurance enough. So review that product liability insurance to make sure that it covers those expanded hazard classes. Update all of your risk assessments, and look at those in terms of priority. Look at those high risk categories. So you know, things like that, not knowing which sectors you'll sit in at the moment, but medical devices, chemicals with long-term exposure risks, all those kind of things would be what we would determine as high risk categories. Training and internal awareness of, you know, this new regulation and what it means to the organization. So training on compliance, across the board, so research and development, marketing teams on the new CLP requirements, you're all singing off the same hymn sheet. Ensuring that online sales teams understand the obligations for digital hazard communication. And I think in terms of priority, it's educating, and basically educating those teams that are handling consumer facing products in e-commerce channels, because they are the ones that often have to impart information or communicate information in more layman's terms, rather than the kind of like technical blurb that maybe a business customer in the same field could understand. And then the last thing really is keep informed. Sign up for any kind of information that you can. Certainly we will update regularly, so as and when we get the next tranche of further information on the implementation of this, then we'll rerun this webinar with an update. But you can also subscribe directly on the EU Commission website for updates on delegated acts and so on, which is always quite worth doing. And then the final slide really is just those of you on the call today may have been invited onto this call anyway, so you'll already have opted into our community. But we cover regulation at the EU and global level across a whole range of different disciplines: product safety, sustainability, customs regulation. There's a whole raft of it, and we've got it mapped out to 2040. And finally, we've got this voice to share it with SMEs, so that they can be that one step ahead. So this webinar today is just one of several. I've lost count of how many we've done and how many we have planned to do. So if you want to be part of that community and get invitations to further webinars, then just opt in. Similarly, I appreciate that, you know, throwing information at you today is very generic and not necessarily custom to your particular challenge or ambition for export into the EU. So you may want to book a call with us to ask any questions that maybe you haven't wanted to ask on the call today. And we're always happy, for the sake of you know, a short brief call, to jump on and say, yes, you're on the right track, or no, you might want to think of it this way. Whatever the situation, we're quite happy to jump on a brief kind of no obligation free chat if it is at all helpful. And then finally, the last slide is my contact details. So on that note, I am going to end. I'm conscious